On June 4th, 2024, coffins draped in French flags were found at the Eiffel Tower in Paris. French media quickly blamed Russia. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, posters appeared warning French troops against following in the footsteps of their forefathers, an ominous reference to past French wars where French troops actively fought against Russia and Germany with devastating results for France. All of this follows the planning and discussion by French President Emmanuel Macron to send French troops to Ukraine to help train new recruits. These discussions and plans drew Russia to threaten France and NATO, stating that Russia would directly target French troops in Ukraine. This saga, along with permission from the United States and other Western countries for Ukraine to strike Russian targets inside of Russia with Western-provided weapons, have brought the whole conflict closer to a direct Western conflict with Russia. But how exactly did we get here? How did the deployment of little green men to Crimea in 2014 lead to the brink of World War III?
Ukraine is now a nation at war.
In 2021, after 7 years of war between Ukraine and Russia, which saw the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of parts of Ukraine's Donbas region, things began to heat up. Russian troops surged towards the border of Ukraine, as well as into Belarus. This was under the guise of a military exercise. However, it was immediately clear that this wasn't just a normal exercise. Field hospitals were created, which, paired with the surge in negotiations between Russian, Ukrainian, and NATO representatives, implied that this was potentially for real. After negotiations broke down, Russian President Putin addressed the Russian people on February 24, 2022, announcing the beginning of a new special military operation. Immediately, Russian missiles streaked across the Ukrainian sky, hitting military, government, and civilian infrastructure. Russian tanks crossed the border as well, with advances in the north from Belarus targeting Kiev, east through Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts, and south from Donetsk and Crimea. NATO, who had warned Russia from any kind of invasion of Ukraine, refrained from intervening. Instead, US planes and drones over the Black Sea helped spot Russian forces for Ukraine. The first few days of the war were quite chaotic. Russian troops made rapid advances across several parts of Ukraine, and it wasn't long before a massive Russian force was on the outskirts of Kiev. Initially, Russia's goal was to seize the Hostomel airport north of Kiev. From there, they'd fly in Russian airborne forces, the VDV, and then march on the city. However, fierce fighting at the airport and the shooting down of two Il-76 aircraft which carry the VDV forced Russia to scrap the plan altogether. Having failed to secure the airspace over Ukraine, Russia still had to contend with Ukrainian aircraft and anti-air systems. Russian forces at the gates of Kiev, though, began to have issues of their own. Waiting for reinforcements from the advance through the Sumy Oblast, the Kiev axis quickly ran out of fuel, food, and ammunition. Long columns of Russian trucks and tanks were photographed outside of Kiev, with the city of Kiev preparing for a fight to the end. Civilians formed independent militias, with the Ukrainian military helping civilians to equip with weapons and create Molotov cocktails. The United States, not able to intervene themselves but still wanting to help a democracy under attack, began sending some lethal aid on February 25th, the day after the invasion began, which coincided with the deployment of additional military forces to Europe. This aid included Javelin anti-tank missile launchers and ammo, as well as Stinger anti-air missile launchers and ammo. These weapon systems had an immediate impact on the war. Specifically, Stingers helped blunt a Russian air assault on the Hostomel airport, and Javelins helped blunt Russian advances through Sumy and Kharkiv. While Kiev fell under siege, Russia made advances elsewhere throughout the country. Nowhere saw Russian advances more prominent than in the south from Crimea. Russia was able to advance both northeast of Crimea, isolating and ultimately capturing the port city of Mariupol after a fierce fight that ended in the Azov steel plant. To the northwest of Crimea, Russia was able to cross the Dnieper River and take the city of Kherson, posturing for a push to Ukraine's other major port city of Odessa and the Russian-backed separatist region of Transnistria. These forces were also able to capture the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Fighting was witnessed from security cameras around the world from this plant. All of this, however, hinged on the capture of Kiev. Should Kiev fall and the Ukrainian government collapse, all of these advances would quickly consolidate gains and seize the rest of Ukraine. However, that's not what happened. With Ukrainian attacks on Russian supply convoys supporting the Sumy advance, as well as stiff defenses outside of Kiev, it became clear that the fight for Kiev was not going to be a quick one, and that was bad news for Russia. Their forces outside Kiev weren't supplied for a longer fight, and after weeks of fighting outside the city and growing supply challenges, the Kiev advance was forced to retreat back over the border of Belarus. With no forces left to support in Kiev, the Sumy advance also quickly fell back. As they retreated, Ukrainian troops would discover civilians who had been tied up and shot in the streets at Bucha, a suburb of Kiev which Russia had occupied during the siege. This was a preview to the terror that would unfold in Russian-occupied regions throughout the war. Russian forces, which had surrounded Kharkiv and had pushed throughout southern Ukraine, quickly began to dig in for a longer war. A longer war which they were initially not prepared for. After the retreat from Kiev, Russian forces would soon be slow to a stop in Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk. Emboldened by Ukraine's sturdy defense, the United States and other NATO countries began sending more aid to Ukraine. However, fearful of Russian retaliation, that aid remained limited. More modern US and European main battle tanks, fighter aircraft, and long-range missiles were totally off the table. The US would, however, send HIMARS, or the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. This system would prove very effective. Almost immediately, Russian logistics facilities, headquarters, and troop gatherings were targeted. Russian generals were being killed, and the vulnerability of Russian troops and logistics forced Russia to disperse its forces. These strikes, combined with the halting of the Russian advance, set the stage for Ukraine's first counteroffensive in the war. A counteroffensive that would change everything. In the fall of 2022, Ukraine would begin its counteroffensive focused on two main areas, Kharkiv and Kherson. In Kherson, Ukraine would run into sophisticated Russian defensive positions, and the counteroffensive quickly became a grinding, attritional assault that would soon become a theme in this war. In Kharkiv, however, Ukraine was met with light resistance and was able to push the Russians all the way back across the border. This breakthrough in Kharkiv would become a tremendous political win for Ukraine. After what had appeared to be a war that Ukraine could not win in the beginning, Ukraine had shown that it could not only stop Russia, it may have a chance of actually winning the war. Dealing with disadvantageous terrain, with a river to their backs which complicated reinforcement and resupply, Russia would soon retreat from Kherson. This retreat would preserve the majority of their forces, though, as Ukraine was unable to pursue and annihilate the retreating Russian troops. Fear quickly grew, though, that Russia would protect its retreat or even counterattack using tactical nuclear weapons. This is when the nuclear threats began to become even more dangerous from Russia. The US would make clear that any nuclear attack on Ukraine would be responded to directly by the United States, either with a conventional response against Russian forces in Ukraine or with a nuclear response. In either case, the nuclear threats would continue, however no nuclear weapons would be used. As 2022 came to an end and the war concluded its first full year, it became abundantly clear to both Ukraine and to Russia, as well as to the rest of the world, that this war would not be a quick one at all. Russia would begin its first rounds of mobilization, with Ukraine having already mobilized before the war began. Russia's mobilization would prove unpopular, with hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing Russia into neighboring Georgia and other surrounding countries, many of those leaving being young men eligible for the draft. This would ultimately lead Russia to partially close its borders to prevent people from leaving. Russia would ultimately have to begin offering different incentives for those who would volunteer for the military, including high payouts upon signing and good regular pay. One of Russia's most helpful and effective groups that assisted them in the war, not only with recruitment, but also with battlefield efforts, was a private military contractor by the name of Wagner. Named after the German composer Richard Wagner, Wagner was run by Dmitry Utkin, a former Russian Special Forces soldier and extreme ultranationalist, as well as Putin's former chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Wagner had previously been involved in Russian operations elsewhere in the Middle East and Africa, where it still operates to this day. There were and are other private military companies in Ukraine, but Wagner would soon become the most politically significant. As Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in Kharkiv and Kherson, Russia would continue its grinding offensive in Donetsk. The bloody battles of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk would soon give way to the Battle of Bakhmut. While Bakhmut wasn't tactical or strategically significant on its own, it soon became very politically significant for both sides. Russia would pour over 100,000 troops, many of them being Wagner fighters, attempting to take the city. After several months of fighting and over 100,000 casualties, Russia would ultimately manage to take the city. However, while fighting to take Bakhmut, Russia would not only send Wagner forward in what were called meat assaults, a graphic nickname for human wave attacks. They would also be accused of withholding artillery ammunition from Wagner, effectively bleeding it dry. Fearful of Prigozhin's growing political influence within the military, or jealous of Wagner's prominence, the motives of this choice are not abundantly clear. In either case, a furious Prigozhin would publish rant after rant against Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the commander of the armed forces Valery Gerasimov. This would all come to a head in June of 2023. After accusing the Russian military of striking a Wagner camp, Prigozhin would launch a mutiny against the Russian Ministry of Defense. This would almost immediately overshadow the fall of Bakhmut for Ukraine, which would watch this whole scenario alongside the rest of the world in absolute amazement. Prigozhin launched two separate marches, one towards the Russian headquarters in Rostov-on-Don and the other towards Moscow. While doing so, they would have standoffs against Russian military at the headquarters in Rostov before being granted access, where Prigozhin would take custody of two Russian generals. On the way to Moscow, however, they were virtually unopposed. Russian National Guardsmen would hastily attempt to create trenches and defenses to stop the convoy, however they wouldn't succeed. Prigozhin, however, would fail to capture either Shoigu or Gerasimov. Of course, Putin would not just let this whole thing happen. Shortly after it began, the mutiny would abruptly end, with Wagner troops on the outskirts of Moscow and Prigozhin suddenly leaving Rostov-on-Don. Wagner would be reassigned into Belarus to assist with the training of the Belarusian military. Russia would also begin the process of dismantling Wagner as a force, recruiting or retiring Wagner fighters, leaving only its forces in Africa to continue operations. Prigozhin would ultimately be killed alongside Dmitry Utkin in a plane crash near Moscow. By this point, Russia was looking less like the fearsome successor to the Soviet Union and more like a circus full of clowns, with a whole lot of tanks, which is a heck of a combination, I've got to say. However, it would not be long before Russia would correct that image. Ukraine would broadcast for months that it was planning a counteroffensive in 2023. While it was preparing, the United States and other NATO countries would become emboldened in their aid for Ukraine. Systems which had been previously off the table were now on the table. Abrams and Leopard tanks, as well as Bradley and Marder IFVs, would be making their way to Ukraine. Longer-range missiles like ATACMS and Storm Shadow would also make their way to Ukraine. Even F-16s would begin to make their way to Ukraine. Now Ukraine's military was becoming even more modernized, receiving Western equipment and Western training as it prepared for its counteroffensive. Russia, on the other hand, was not wasting its time. Russia would create what would become nicknamed the Surovikin Line, named after the general in charge of the development at the time. Surovikin would be ousted from the military due to his close ties with Prigozhin and the Wagner Group after the coup. The Surovikin Line, however, would prove to be a sturdy defense. Once Ukraine finally launched its 2023 counteroffensive, it ran into significant challenges. Unable to breach the Surovikin Line, Ukraine would have to ultimately call off the counteroffensive, well short of any of its actual goals. And once again, Ukraine, Russia, and the rest of the world would realize that this war was going to be going on for quite a long time. As the war entered into its third year, Russia would continue its grinding offensive. The city of Avdiivka, which was north of Donetsk City and had been held by Ukraine since the beginning of the war as far back as 2014, became Russia's next focal point. Heavily fortified and defended, the Battle for Avdiivka would rival the Battle of Bakhmut in terms of severity. However, Russian casualties would not be as high as in Bakhmut. However, they would lose more equipment in Avdiivka than they did in Bakhmut. And this is one area where the style of fighting that we see today would become even more clear. Drones, from small commercial FPV drones to larger delivery drones, would permeate the battlefield. Short on artillery shells, with Western aid beginning to slow down, Ukraine would have to become more creative, using these drones to fill the gap. While Russia has incredibly sophisticated electronic warfare equipment, it still suffered tremendous losses due to drones. From grenades and mortars being dropped from drones to faster, more agile kamikaze drones, they've become a real threat not just to infantry, but even to heavy equipment like tanks and IFVs. This led to the creation of what's called the cope cage, which is a cage placed on top of tanks and APCs to protect it from overhead threats, which can target it where its armor is weakest. These cope cages didn't originate in 2023, they were seen as early as really the beginning of the war. However, it was during the Battle of Avdiivka that we began to see even more creative implementations of the cope cage. Having lost significant numbers of tanks and other heavy equipment, Russia has also had to resort to some pretty creative strategies to protect its troops as they advance. One of the more recent notable inventions has been dubbed the turtle tank. It may look silly, but by all accounts, it has worked in helping to keep these vehicles alive. After months of fighting, Avdiivka would soon fall, and this would take Ukraine to one of the darkest places that it has been since the beginning of the war. At this point, the United States hadn't delivered any aid to Ukraine in quite some time, and Ukrainian troops were struggling to get the ammunition that they needed. It's widely believed that the ammunition shortage is why Ukraine would have to give up Avdiivka in the first place. With a stream of bad news from the front and the drying up of Western aid, some in Ukraine began to grow frustrated with the United States and with the war itself. Zelensky would directly call out the United States. Around this time, he would also fire his commander of the armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, and replace him with Alexander Syrsky. Elsewhere on the battlefield, things appeared to have frozen. Gradual movement would appear from time to time, however much of the front resembled World War I, where troops hid in trenches with occasional attacks over open terrain that proved incredibly costly. However, unlike World War I, drones infested the battlefield. With things looking bleak, fears began to grow in Europe on what things would look like if Russia actually won the war. Would Putin actually stop at Ukraine? Or would he attempt to attack the Baltics? Would he attempt to test NATO's resolve by targeting one of its newer members in Finland or Sweden? Would Belarus get involved? What about the persistent nuclear threats? Would Putin use nukes to break a stalemate? All this would come to a head when, during a meeting with other European Union leaders, French President Emmanuel Macron would do the most French thing ever. He said, quote, "There is no consensus on whether or not to send troops to Ukraine, and France will keep all options on the table." Mind you, at this point, F-16s were only recently announced to go to Ukraine, and they still hadn't actually physically arrived in Ukraine. But sending troops to Ukraine, especially NATO troops, was 100% off the table. Once Macron said those words, he elaborated no further, until he did when he said that France might send troops to help free up Ukrainian troops in the West with training and logistics work. Russia did its thing and responded with nuclear threats and said that it would target French troops once they arrive. And that more or less takes us to where we are in the midpoint of 2024. French troops may be heading to Ukraine, and Russia is sending threats to France to scare the French people about the war, including, perhaps, the coffins found at the Eiffel Tower. The US is in the middle of an election which may greatly impact the flow of aid and the overall US strategy towards the war. Ukraine and the European Union know it, so they are trying to prepare for that while also equipping Ukraine for a longer fight. The United States and other providers have also given Ukraine permission to strike Russian targets inside of Russia with Western weapons. This came even after Russia threatened direct military conflict between Russia and the United States. These strikes, so far at least, have proven very effective, not only in disrupting Russia's small but recent incursion into Kharkiv, but also in disrupting Russian logistics operations, supporting their operations in the south and east of Ukraine. This is all happening while Russia is supposed to begin another summer offensive. And that's what's been happening in Ukraine so far. Now, with all that, I want to hear your thoughts on this video. Let me know what you think down in the video comments. What do you think that we might be seeing next in this conflict? Be sure to leave a like, and that can help raise awareness on what's going on. And subscribe to join the Nerd Army. We're almost at 300. As soon as we get to 500, I'll be able to post community posts, and that'll make it a lot easier for me to give updates, outside of a video format. With all that, I'll be seeing y'all next time. Later.